Good afternoon. Today I'm going to present to you a video about hemochromatosis. Now, what is hemochromatosis? Most of you have probably never heard of it before. Well, it is the name of a disease arising from an inherited genetic mutation, a devastating disease that you might have. And there is no need to worry. Although not curable, it is definitely manageable. It is common but unknown, an anomaly in an otherwise normal life. In the simplest definition, hemochromatosis is a genetic disease that makes you absorb too much iron due to the lack of specific proteins that normally regulate the amount of iron absorbed from intestinal walls. Now, how can iron be bad for you? You need to survive. It is a useful mineral. Yes and no. Iron in a small quantity is necessary and certainly not harmful, but in large amounts it can cause serious damages. An iron overload will ultimately result in joint pain, chronic fatigue, liver damage, and heart failure, etc. We can see here the differences between the iron overload in an average person and a person with hemochromatosis. As you can see, the blue column shows the average person. That person has a mere 2.5 grams of iron in its body at any one time. Of course, there are variables such as iron supplement intake, blood loss, etc. On the other hand, someone with developed hemochromatosis aged 30 to 40 with a level of iron in the bodies of 20 grams, 8 times more than necessary. This is not very precise as it is a generalization for the sake of simplicity and represents an average of both male and female values with very different iron concentration at different ages. Women develop hemochromatosis much more slowly as they have a menstrual cycle, which enables them to have a natural loss of blood and therefore iron, which represents a kind of natural monthly phlebotomy, that is bloodletting, being essentially the most efficient and natural treatment for hemochromatosis. Iron can be taken into your body in other ways than just absorption from food. As you can see here, there are 4 different ways to intake iron: inhalation, ingestion, injection, and decompartmentalization. The most common in MEDCs, most economically developed countries, is consumption, but in industrial LADCs, they do not have proper protection and can be exposed to iron through inhalation much more easily. As said before, one of the most common and earliest symptoms of hemochromatosis is chronic fatigue. Ironically, the treatment for such fatigue is to administer iron supplements, which makes hemochromatosis worse. Such ignorance and practice is common. Over 30% of surveyed patients have been prescribed iron supplements by their doctors for a few years before being finally diagnosed correctly. This is why raising awareness of hemochromatosis is so important. Hemochromatosis is not like an infection. It cannot be caught. It is a genetic mutation, so the only way to have it is through genetic material transferred through generations. Hemochromatosis is the most commonly presented in male Caucasians and is said to be passed on by the Vikings. It has to be passed on by both your parents, as you need to have the bad gene from both parents. We said then that you are homozygous recessive. Otherwise, you are simply a carrier, but the disease is not expressed and you do not suffer the consequences. In other words, the hemochromatosis gene is recessive. So in this scenario, 25% of the children will be a sufferer of hemochromatosis. So once again, it is very important to raise awareness in the general population and the medical community because the symptoms of every diffuse and varied and do not point out immediately to the disease. It is also important to understand that you can simply be a carrier for several generations with no symptoms, but that a child born from 2 carriers can be born homozygote and that several decades later suffer the consequences of an iron overload. Now today I have a guest with me. Mr. Liev has been diagnosed with hemochromatosis and I would like to ask him a few questions.
So when did you first realize that you had hemochromatosis?
Well, interestingly enough, actually, it was about a year after my heart attack, and I had 2 stents placed, and it was actually during a kind of a checkup with the GP who asked me, you know, perhaps now you've been taking some medicines for your heart for about a year, everything is going well, and I ended up just doing a whole series of tests, okay, blood tests, and a little while after having the results, I didn't really pay attention to them, nor did the GP. And that shows again the lack of awareness of the disease both from the community, the population, general population, and the medical community. It's only somehow by accident that I actually went cycling with the laboratory technician, and when he actually asked me where I was coming from, I said Brittany, we had a little chat, and he said, well, I saw your level, iron level was very high, and I think I advise you to redo the test and confirm the test. And I didn't really know what he was talking about. But I redid the test, okay, and again it was, the iron level was about 4 times the normal level, okay, and it's when I realized that, I had to actually undergo an additional test for gene mutation, and that clearly highlighted the fact that I had a mutation and that I was suffering from hemochromatosis. So that's a little bit by accident. First results, nobody paid attention to them, and in fact, looking back, it was something that I could have identified much earlier because I had joint pains and knuckle pains in my hands. The first clinical symptoms is when you shake hands with somebody very hard, it hurts your knuckles, and it is being said in textbooks that perhaps it's one of the first symptoms. So joint pain, fatigue are the 2 main symptoms which could have directed me towards the disease, but because of lack of awareness, I was not aware. Even the GP was not really, somehow looking for it specifically.
So, how has hemochromatosis affected your social life at work and at home?
I'm not sure this is a straightforward answer for this one. I don't think it necessarily affects your social life per se. Perhaps once you're aware that you have the disease, you carry the gene mutation, basically, you change some of your habits that you had before. And I think perhaps the one I have changed most was perhaps the way I eat and what I eat. And in that sense, it has somehow affected also the family, in the sense that we are aware of where the iron is, so to speak, and how to avoid the iron. For example, like I think as a family we probably eat far less red meat than the normal, perhaps American family, so to speak. It has affected my work. No, it does affect you, of course, in the long term if you don't treat it, or if you don't pay attention to it, and you ignore it, and then you leave, the iron is poisoning you little by little internally. So you will suffer from chronic fatigue and more pains in your joints, etc. So it has affected you. It will affect you, and of course your work, social life. You become more, irascible and more, angry for little things. If you treat it, then you become normal, so to speak, again, and therefore that's kind of negative impact on your life. It goes. Perhaps even if you treat it well by giving blood regularly and checking your blood level, perhaps one area where it affects your life is that you become a little bit of an ambassador, okay, and you speak. And you want people to check their iron level, and you want every one of your colleagues and everybody you meet, you want to talk to them about it, because you know that it's the main cause is the lack of awareness, or the main issue is not that you carry the wrong gene, okay? It's that if you are not aware of it, that's when the damage is caused, okay? So you want people to be aware, and you want people to check their iron level, so you become a little bit of an ambassador, and you talk about it. So in that sense, it affects your social life and your work life, because you talk naturally to people about what you're suffering from, and you want them to check it out.
Can you think of any advantages of hemochromatosis?
Of having the disease, you mean? Well, I'm not sure you can think of this as an advantage. I mean, perhaps you should look at it in a different way. Perhaps advantages to me, no. But perhaps if you look at the hypothesis that people have formulated to explain why the gene survived, then you realize that because it is a little bit like if you had been doped with EPO, you have too much iron, therefore a lot of hemoglobin. So in terms of resistance and stamina for sports such as marathon running or cycling, then where you need a lot of stamina, then you find that you have a slight natural advantage over the others. In that sense, you could think that it's one of the reasons as to why the gene survived over the millions of years, when perhaps Cro-Magnon was actually needed to have a lot of resistance to actually run after animals for several days in a row to catch up on an animal to feed his family. It might have provided him with a certain resistance that others didn't have, and therefore the gene has survived through millions of years. But advantages for me as an individual, I would think today in our society, no, probably none.
So, do you think there should be nationally implemented tests for hemochromatosis?
Well, that has been debated a lot, to be honest. I think even looking at France specifically, when I look at it, the situation going back many years, where some people leading the association, patient association in Brittany, have been writing to the health minister at the time, trying to get you're talking about 60 million people. I think, I'm not sure, and yet it costs very little. It's just a blood sample, it's €2 or €3 cost, and then you do perhaps the test on the gene mutation testing, perhaps if people have a high level of iron. Of course, you won't know whether a teenager will have you have to wait until you have 25, 30, 35 years old to see that there's an accumulation of iron. At the age of 12, 15, probably there's no accumulation yet visible. So you could, I think one of the ideas that I've had personally was that if a GP sees a patient for the first time in his career, in his life, he could say, have you had that check? Have you checked that once? And if the patient says, no, I never checked my iron level, then perhaps they could say, they could decide to do it for the sake of €2 or €3. I think it's probably worth it. As a nation, you might think that it may not be worth implementing, as opposed to an immunization for a very severe disease and all that. But of course, as an individual, you feel very differently. Because as an individual, I feel that if I had the tests 10, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have suffered the consequence, perhaps even of the heart attack I had, which is not necessarily correlated scientifically, but there's people suggesting that, scientists suggesting perhaps there's a correlation between hemochromatosis and heart attack. There are certainly collateral damages, like hip replacements and knee replacement that cost a lot to society and to social security, as opposed to having a blood sample done 10 years earlier.
Do you think that a greater awareness of hemochromatosis could benefit others?
You mean greater awareness at the level of the population, or greater awareness at the level of the medical community, or?
Well, both. As the local population, you should be aware that you might have this disease, and in the medical community, you should be aware that the disease is possible and should be included in your diagnosis.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at the statistics, you're talking about people being diagnosed finally with hemochromatosis on average after 8 years of suffering from the disease fairly severely. So you have people who end up with hip replacement, knee replacement, ankle replacement, and only then sometimes after all these operations, suddenly somebody suggests to do a test for the iron level, and they find that they have hemochromatosis. So on average, when you look at the statistics that it takes 8 years to diagnose the disease, and the consequences of having disease at that time are pretty serious, for the sake of €2 or €3 for a blood sample, yes, I mean people should actually, be asked. They should be asked the question. The GP systematically should probably, the first time he sees a new patient, ask, have you had a blood test done? And should people, society, social security not accept, or insurance not accept to reimburse, although insurance I would think they will support that, because then they have to reimburse hip replacement or serious operations. So it would cost more, as I said, to insurance or social security, so health insurance. So I think it's people should even have the option of paying for it, so to speak.
What things have you realized once you were told you had hemochromatosis? For example, the knuckle pain, the arthritis you had, the revelation that that was caused by hemochromatosis and could have been avoided if you knew before.
That's an interesting question, actually. I think the first thing that you feel is, like most people probably who have a serious disease, incurable disease, is unfair. Why should it be me? Perhaps that's the first thing the first feeling that comes to you, to your heart, so to speak. Then there is when you realize that actually all it takes is a blood sample that costs close to nothing, a couple of euros to do, and that there are some elements that like knuckle pain early on, like 8 years ago for me, that could have been, triggering that test and avoided perhaps the heart attack I've had, 7 years later. When you realize that, then you feel anger. You're angry with the system, and you feel there's something that should be done. So, and perhaps that's why you become somehow a kind of ambassador, and then you enjoy talking to your colleagues and your friends, your family, and anybody you meet, you for the first time, you will probably ask to, have you been tested for hemochromatosis once in your life? And particularly people that talk about a bit of arthritic pain or in joint or something, then you ask them the question, and you really want to help them identifying perhaps something they don't know they have, as opposed to waiting for another 5 or 10 years when there's some irreversible damage made to their body.